Greetings. Thank you for joining us for another reading from the After Midnight series here on WooFDRiver.com. I'm Bentley Bryant, and I'll be reading from one of my short tales. This one is The Pizza Pub, Part 2. That same night, Joel had a dream. He couldn't recall it the next morning, but knew it had something to do with darkness. He woke up several times during the night, sweating and unable to go back to sleep. He would eventually fall back to sleep, only to start dreaming again, picking up where he'd left off. The next morning, as soon as he turned on his TV, every news station was reporting what had happened just a couple of blocks away from the pizza pub. Because of that, Joel became instantly interested in the story. Due to the sensitive nature of the ongoing investigation surrounding the story, the name of the victim or the way she was found had not been released. Crime in the way of robberies and shootings were prevalent in the area, so Joel and everyone else were numb to the story. Most of the incidents were attributed to the wealthy, careless college kids in the area. From a criminal's mindset, most of the college kids there were an easy target, especially after a few drinks. There had been several college assemblies speaking on this issue. Administrators encouraged students to use the buddy system when traveling to and fro on and off campus. Of course, most of the rich kids ignored this request because most of them felt invincible. Usually a huge mistake on their part. The number of students robbed and beaten at gunpoint were astounding. Even so, only a handful of the deaths had ever occurred, so this case was getting special attention. To some of the onlookers, this was just another case of someone at the wrong place at the wrong time. To forensic experts on site, this was already one of the most bizarre cases ever in the city. It would be over a week before the hostess's name was released as the victim in this heinous crime. 3 days after the incident, a few of her co-workers began to figure out that the victim may have been her because she never missed work. According to the schedule, she'd missed 2 days, and this wasn't like her at all. Meeting her that one time for the tour, and later having dinner with her, Joel had no idea that this was an uncharacteristic trait of hers. The main cook at the pub made sure to remind him of that every chance he could. It seemed he had an issue with Joel since day one, and Joel could not figure out why. The cook couldn't wait to tell him the devastating news and seemed overly thrilled to do so. It just so happened that Joel had returned from a food drop when he was hit with the news. "So you heard about your girl?" Joel, who noted that the cook never so much as said 2 words to him before this, looked around to make sure the cook was speaking to him. Joel responded, "What girl?" For a second his mind drifted to Susie Q. It had been a while since he'd seen her, so it was only natural that he'd think of her, although he found thoughts of her at this very moment odd. Coming back to reality, he heard the cook saying something about the hostess and how he heard the cops found her body in 2 places in the alley. Once he processed the information, it hit him like a freight train. Just the thought of someone he knew being killed, much less in such an insane way, made him nauseous. Then the fact that the killer seems to have virtually disappeared didn't help either. All of this and the stupid smirk on the cook's broad face was really more than Joel could bear. He stood there in disbelief and the cook proudly told him what he thought he knew. As he blabbed on, sharing his limited knowledge, Joel drifted away mentally. Back to the night he and the hostess shared the plate of fried wings and the bowl of fried shrooms. He remembered feeling a little guilty since Susie Q had been the only girl he'd ever shared anything with up to that point. He and Susie Q weren't official, but he didn't think that she'd ever share food with another guy. Even now, in the midst of this tragic news, for some reason, he wondered what she would have said if she'd walked up on their little tryst. Apparently, it had been a pretty big deal since the cook brought it up. Joel tuned back in to the cook saying, "Actually, you were the last person she talked to that night. We all saw her before she left, but she didn't say anything to any of us. Guess we're not as cool as the delivery boy." Joel preferred food courier. It just had a nicer ring to it. But whatever, he wasn't letting the cook faze him in the least. This made the cook talk even louder. He'd also been holding, waving, and pointing a large butcher knife the whole time, just to help add to the effect of what he was saying, no doubt. He looked and sounded a bit hostile, but Joel always remained cool, calm, and collected. He wondered himself how he did it, feeling as though he was being interviewed by a bad cop for this craziness. Finally spoke. "Wow, I had no idea." And he really didn't. The cook continued on his bad cop role, and Joel continued to ignore him, grabbing his deliveries and walking out the back door. A few weeks later, once the area near the alley had been cleared and the sidewalks were back to normal, Joel got up the nerve to do a little investigation of his own. He had just completed 2 food drops, and on the way back to the pub, he pulled over and parked in a space a block away from the alley. He hadn't spoken with the cook much since that day, and that day he put on the bad cop persona, but the stuff he'd said resonated in the back of Joel's mind. As he walked over towards the alley, he checked his phone to make sure there weren't any food drop orders coming through. He was clear. As he looked up about a half a block away from the alley, he stopped where he stood, causing a couple of people behind him to bump into each other. With people coming and going, anyone standing still stood out like a sore thumb. Joel noticed a person standing still at the corner of the alley, looking in his direction. Incredibly, it looked a lot like Susie Q. Completely focused, Joel began walking towards the person, and the closer he got, the more he was convinced it was Susie. If not for fear of causing a panic, he would have surely yelled out her name. Totally focused on Susie Q and only 100 feet away, Joel didn't see the old fella suddenly change directions in front of him, which caused Joel to trip over his cane. Making sure the old guy was okay, Joel turned to head back to the alley. As he looked over and around the busy street, he noticed that Susie was no longer standing where he could see her. Had she walked back into the alley further? He made it to where she had been standing. She was gone. Looking around in a controlled panic, Joel looked all around the side. It was one way in and one way out, which meant that Susie Q must have stepped out into the crowd. It didn't make sense, but that was the only logical way she could have disappeared so quickly.